respected Mrs. Antony, Prakash, Shubha, Anu, Priya, and Miss Suja, and all the faculties of the English department here, Vijayan sir. Before I begin, I would like to pay my homage to the memory of Dr. Antony, in whose memory we are organizing this talk. And I heard that a whole legion of great luminaries have come and stood here in this memory to deliver this memorial talk. And I am coming at the fag end of that as an interloper, I'm afraid. But anyway, I will try to do justice to the topic given to me. And the key role was played by Mr. Prakash, who actually had to cajole me to take up this project because at present I am suffering from painting. As I am suffering from painting, my house is getting painted and I am the only one there. And I have an exhibition, oncoming group exhibition tomorrow, and I had to do 2 works there. For last 3 or 4 days I didn't have any sleep at all. But in spite of that, I wanted to come here and share my experiences about what little I know about the relationship between visual art and literature. Now, Painter of Modern Life, which he published towards the end of 1890s, the 19th century, to the fag end of 19th century, he wrote an essay, Painter of Modern Life. And that term modern life introduced modernism and seminal cultural changes that was happening in the field of visual art and literature and entire culture. Now what he meant by, and he speaks about the role of a painter in modern life, and he had in mind one particular, quite an insignificant painter, Constantine Guise, and about that painter he said, the business of a modern painter, he within puts in quote, modern. The business of a modern painter is to represent the present. Which is very, very relevant in our discussion today about the crisis of representation in modernism. That is one figure. Then another figure I want to invoke is that of Virginia Woolf. Virginia Woolf, who I think in 1924 she wrote an essay about Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Brown. In that famous essay she says, on or about December 1910, human nature changed. On or about December 1910, human nature changed. And she explains why she speaks about the change of human nature. She had in particular in mind the change in human relationships. Through Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Brown, she was speaking about the kind of paradigm changes that took place in human relationships and so many things. And war was, of course, in the background. It was in this, this background that we approach modernism and what actually happens in modernism and how that had its ramifications in culture, in human culture and all cultural manifestations like visual art, literature and other domains. So remembering these 2 figures in mind, one Baudelaire and the other Virginia Woolf, I want to speak about the crisis in representation in connection with modernism, especially Western modernism particularly. And we have to begin with representation. What exactly is representation? I will do that later. But today, why we discuss literature in connection with other arts? Today we have broken all frontiers of knowledge, and transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary studies is in fashion today. And so many researches are being done between the relationship between literature and visual arts. Of course, literature with other forms of art also, especially visual arts. Now, when we think specifically of the relationship between literature and visual arts, I like to introduce to you a concept called ekphrasis. Ekphrasis. Now, Dennis, my colleague there, he was doing research in Hyderabad, and that is a domain, that's a field of study that he was especially interested in, and his guide, along with his guide. I remember how we used to speak about Shanmudas. We used to speak about ekphrasis. And what is ekphrasis actually? Now, ekphrasis, very simply put, ekphrasis is the representation of a work of art in another work of art. Say, for example, very simply, if I paint a picture about a poem, that is ekphrasis. If I write a poem about a painting, that is ekphrasis. Especially PG students, you must have studied W.H. Auden Musée de Beauvoir, that poem, in which he speaks about a painting by Bruegel, an early Renaissance painter. Bruegel, he saw in the Museum of Modern Art in Brussels, he saw that Museum of Art in Brussels, he saw that painting, Bruegel, and he was actually finding a kind of resonance with that painting. Himself as a writer, he was passing through a crisis, spiritual and political crisis, and he saw so much affinity in that painting, and he wrote a poem called Musée de Beauvoir, in which the theme is that painting by Bruegel, Pieter Bruegel, and the title is The Fall of Icarus. We will begin with that. It's a painting that inspired him to write that poem. And Bruegel, in that medieval period, was speaking about Icarus, we know, the youth who aspired to fly near the sun, and his waxen wings were melted, he fell into the Sea of Dardanelles. That was a story. That is taken from myth, actually. Now, the original story of Icarus and his father Daedalus appeared in Ovid's Metamorphoses. Now, Ovid wrote a poem about Bruegel and Icarus and Daedalus, and from that, Bruegel took that theme and turned it into a painting. So the first level of ekphrasis takes up there, happens there. And in the modern times, towards the end of 1930s, W.H. Auden visits that museum, finds this painting, and writes once again, a poem about that painting. So second level of ekphrasis happens there, in which Auden calls Bruegel a great artist who was obsessed with or concerned with the magnificent human failure. The failure of human aspirations, but the dream was magnificent, and it met with a magnificent failure, and he was concerned with the apathy and indifference of the world to that great grand failure. And in this painting, he was touched by the kind of apathy that is shown by other characters in the painting. There is a farmer tilling the ground, there is a shepherd, and there is a ship. There is a ship that turns its back to the boy sinking, who is relegated to the corner of the frame. Just his protruding foot is seen in the sea. Icarus has fallen, and the whole world is indifferent to that magnificent failure. So this rift between society and the artist, it was this theme that became a central theme of modernism. How artists have gone away from society, how they are alienated from society, and the so-called angst of the artist, his alienation from society. Let us go with that. See, this introduces a central theme in modernism, as I told, the kind of feeling on the part of the artist that they have severed their connections with the society, and the severance between society and the artist became so acute, which began in romantic times, romantic period, which became, which actually accumulated into a crisis during the Victorian period. Even Browning and Tennyson faced this problem of the rift between society and the artist, as illustrated by his Lotus Eaters and Lady of Shalott, all these poems. I don't explain these things, And this theme actually climaxed in the kind of retirement of the artist into the cocoons of his own psyche and explore his internal world. So, this theme of social indifference become a central theme. And my point in this painting is it specifically introduces a point of concurrence between literature on the one hand and visual art on the other. Now another painting with the same ekphrastic mode is Caravaggio's painting, The Conversion of St. Paul. You must have studied in Santa Maria del Popolo by, I think, Tom Gunn's poem. Now that poem is about this painting. It's an ekphrastic poem. Tom Gunn visits a church, and in Santa Maria del Popolo, that church, and he finds this painting, and he looks at that painting and says, "You vile craftsman, you are a very cunning craftsman, and what's the meaning of the gesture of the extended hands of Paul or Saul lying on the ground?" You know, conversion of St. Paul, Saul was a persecutor of Christianity, a very brutal persecutor of Christianity in the early days, and once he was marching to a Christian gathering to persecute them when he fell from horseback, and God visited him in a flash of lightning, and he became partially blind, and that was a moment of conversion for Saul. He became St. Paul later. That is a very crucial moment. It's a Baroque painting by Caravaggio, but again Tom Gunn is touched by this kind of ambiguous statements. He says, does Saul welcome God, that vision, or is he denying that God, resisting God? It can be read both ways. So the possibility of multiple reading, Tom Gunn attributes to this single gesture of extended hands. And this kind of polysemic potential of literature and art become again a central theme in modernism, especially in the early modernism. If you remember T.S. Eliot's Wasteland, the last section, what the thunder said, just the. It can be datta or dayadva or demyada, and it is left to the interpreter. So the subjective rendering of meaning, where 50% of the meaning will be supplied by the artist and the other 50% will be supplied by the perceiver or the reader. That kind of fluidity of interpretation, of course, became very crucial, and that also is illustrated in this ekphrastic painting. This is another ekphrastic painting by a Latin American painter, Jose Hamara. Title is Icaro. It is about Icarus. It's a Latin American rendering of the story, the myth of Icarus. Where is Icarus? Icarus, instead of falling into the sea, Icarus is just landed. His wings are intact now, even now, and he has landed comfortably and into a Bolivian forest, not a sea. And a helicopter figure is hovering around. That is his father, Daedalus. In the earlier Ovid version, Daedalus flies three times, crying, Icaro, 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 and then he disappears. And instead of Daedalus there, the artificer, we have a helicopter here. And if you think of that trajectory, light trajectory, in the form of a curve, that traces the path of the flight of Icarus. Icarus started flying from there, then see, he went there, he came back. Icarus came back. So for a Latin American painter like Jose Hamara, he says we have lost our name even. Americans have taken their name, and we have lost our landscape, we have lost our ecology. So he wants to reclaim their ecology. So as a gesture of reclaiming their ecology, Icarus decides to return to the native land, Bolivian forest. He reclaims it. He traces back. He refuses to fly away. A brilliant rendering of that myth, Icarus myth. You know, if you speak about modernism, interestingly, we had a talk, while we were coming back, Anu was taking me, we were talking about myth, her interest in myth, and I was telling, in order to understand modernism, you have to have a mythical sense. And Icarus, figure of Icarus, is a key figure in modernism. So many writers have written about Icarus. What about Ulysses? What about Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man? Stephen Dedalus. His name is Dedalus, but he is an Icarus figure in search of the Father. James Joyce has written about Icarus, and so many painters have written about Icarus. Icarus is a myth that hovers in modernist literature and painting. Why? Because it embodies a grand dream. They know very well that it will end in failure. But the human freedom to aspire to fly high is epitomized in the figure of Icarus. Then, this another Icarus figure by our own painter Surendran Nair. Shanmugas may know him, Prakash may know him. A Malayali painter, a close friend of mine, settled in Baroda, internationally known painter. This was painted for a national exhibition, and there is a history about that painting. On the eve of the national exhibition, cultural ministry, agents from cultural ministry burst into the gate crashed into the museum and confiscated that painting and dumped it in a toilet. Their argument was, it was a huge painting. Their argument was, it desecrated a national symbol, Ashoka pillar. Because here, Surendran Nair has given the title, An Actor Rehearsing an Interior Monologue of Icarus. Here is not Icarus, but an actor trying to rehearse the role of Icarus, perched on the Ashoka pillar, and he is facing into infinity. He is preparing to fly, he is rehearsing the flight. And anyway, because Ashoka pillar was there, they said it was a desecration of actually a national symbol, confiscated it. And eventually, all the artists withdrew their work, the exhibition did not take off. But when we discussed, Surendran talked to me, I even wrote an article about that in a magazine, Sense and Sensibility, Sense and Censorship in Indian Art. And Surendran was actually happy, he was not at all concerned. He said, even before I finished that painting, it was sold out for a fabulous price. It was actually taken away from that toilet, was taken away to the client for a fabulous price. But anyway, he retorted with another painting. He retorted with another interesting painting. Such is a history. My theme is another ekphrastic rendition of Icarus. See how one single figure, mythological figure, traverses through literature and art, passing through all these domains, stating so many concerns: political, cultural, historical, psychological. This is something that especially happens in modernism. Now, another painting I show, this is by Piet Mondrian, a modernist painter, an abstract expressionist American painter, Piet Mondrian, called Boogie Woogie. Boogie Woogie. Abstraction, sheer abstraction. And paintings like this are one of the reasons why people generally are very skeptical or critical of modern art, saying we don't understand anything. Is it an art and all these things? What's the meaning of these things? Simply squares, bigger and smaller squares in different colors. It is exhibited in Museum of Modern Art in New York. What's the meaning of that? And that introduces another concern of modernism, the close relationship between music and modernism. You can't understand modernism, you can't understand especially early modernists like James Joyce and T.S. Eliot unless you know something about, Wagner. Richard Wagner actually looms large in the literary domain. Without understanding the contributions of Wagner, you can't understand Eliot, you can't understand Joyce, you can't understand even Baudelaire, Nietzsche. You can't understand. Why? Why so? What was the contribution of Wagner to modernism? Because Wagner, you must have heard about Wagner in connection with Wasteland and all. He had a vast, grand depiction of Norse mythology, actually called Twilight of the Gods, Nibelungen trilogy. And then he wrote about a whole operatic rendition of Parsifal, the search of the grave, holy grave. And Tristan and Isolde. He wrote another opera on the romantic relationship between Tristan and Isolde. All these operas, operatic renditions are very seminal to understanding modernism. Now what did he do? He was actually ferreting out ancient myths and projecting these myths into the political and cultural domain of 20th century. That is one way of tackling myth to present an existing crisis or existing traumatic experience. And in this relation, I would like to remind you about an essay that T.S. Eliot wrote in connection with James Joyce's novel Ulysses. Almost the same time, he wrote an essay called Ulysses, Myth and Order. Ulysses, Myth and Order, in which he says about the use of myth. Myth is a way of ordering, of controlling, of giving a shape and a significance to the immense panorama of futility and anarchy that is contemporary history. That is contemporary history. Because modern world is, chaotic. If you remember Second Coming, W. Waits, then Wasteland, they were actually trying to come to terms with the chaotic experience of the anarchic experience of modern life, and an easy way out was resorting to a myth. So mythical method was closely affiliated to modernist expressions in both literature and art. And in the same way, Wagner, by reworking the Norse mythology, was actually pointing a way to defining the immense panorama of futility. How the gods' world crumpled, twilight of the gods. Odin's world completely crumples finally as a result of a curse. A brilliant tragedy in opera. And opera, the very concept of opera was a contribution of Wagner. Opera. What was the contribution? Because it was Wagner who first presented a musical performance in the form of a theatre. Opera is both music and theatre. And Wagner was the first man he was a composer only, but he was the first man to not only conduct music but write verse for that. We call it libretti. A symphony composition, writing of the symphony composition we call libretti, and presentation is the business of a composer. So Wagner was both a composer and a writer, and he was in that operatic vision. He was actually introducing the idea of a total theatre, and that began with the concept of opera that influenced all modern writers. The same total theatre effect you can find in Wasteland. Is it drama, it's poem, it's drama, it's statements, there is myth, like that. So Wagner is very important, and here coming to Mondrian, this meaning is explained by, actually there is a composer, a pianist who played based on this notation. He says this is a musical notation. Boogie woogie, boogie woogie is of African origin, African music, and its rhythm is very, very tantalizing rhythm in common time, 1, 2, 3, 4, like that. And when you read a sheet, musical sheet, especially for piano, we was actually piano music. In piano, there is a top portion meant for lead, what we call treble clef, and below it is bass clef. So there will be both treble clef, leading clef, and bass music below. And left hand side will be, we are playing piano, left hand side we will play bass, and with right we will play treble. And boogie is the left hand side of bass portion, and woogie is the right hand side of treble clef. And they say that Piet Mondrian has composed the whole thing as a notation. If you look at the left hand side and right hand side, there are variations, slight variations. All these squares stand for musical notations, and one composer has even played music. Just a second. മോളെ ഇത് കുത്താം. ഓണാണോ? The painting is being played. The pianist is playing boogie woogie. This is the rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. It's a jazz rhythm actually, blues rhythm. That is boogie woogie. And Piet Mondrian, most of his abstract paintings are musical notations. That began with Kandinsky. So Kandinsky was the first man to speak about the relationship between music and visual art. Kandinsky, one of the constructivist modern painters, he said, music is the form of art that goes straightly direct to the human heart. Direct to the human heart. And no language is needed for music. No language is needed to music. Language is universal. And he was trying to compose painting visually, each color standing for each sound notation or swarasthana or raga, and he was trying to compose like that. Our own Ragamala paintings. Our own Ragamala paintings, each painting corresponds to a raga or Ragini. In Hindustani, Ragini Todi is there, Ragini Lalita is there, all paintings, visual rendering. That was another brilliant experience in modernism. How you can bring in all, you are breaking all boundaries. It was a boundary breaking movement actually, very seminal movement, demolishing the margins between music and visual art. And relating to the importance of music, I will speak about iambic pentameter. Why Shakespeare was obsessed with iambic pentameter? Why Elizabethan times was obsessed with iambic pentameter? What is iambic pentameter? What is iambic pentameter? Unstressed, stressed, now this is the rhythm of iambic pentameter. Why iambic? That began with Greek times. Greek times. And why iambic is so fascinating for us? Because iambic, they say, corresponds to the beat of the human heart, systolic, diastolic, systolic, diastolic. You listen for 5 minutes, you will get lost in that. It can capture human heart, and you vibrate, you start vibrating to that rhythm of the music that is most related to human condition and any walk of life. And today iambic is so prevalent among folk music, all kinds of popular music, pop music, folk music, reggae for example. What's the rhythm of reggae? 1 2 1 2 1 2. We call it syncopated rhythm. Any folk music all over the world, you find the rhythm is basically iambic. I will show you, to prove that, I will show you a video. And what's the rhythm of rap? The latest form of music, rap. Rap is iambic. And they believe that Shakespeare was the greatest rapper. He was the greatest rapper. See. One, two, 1 2 1 2. Yeah, that was Shakespeare in action, iambic. Now we will come to, a discussion of my topic actually, crisis in representation, modernism in art and literature. Now look at this photograph. What is it about? Railway lines, common experience that we all have. It's a photograph and you call it railway, parallel track, railway track. Is there anything strange about this? Or let me ask, is it real? It is a photograph, it must be real, but is it real? Can it happen in real life? Can parallel lines ever converge? Railway track is parallel, but when you stand at a particular point and look at the railway track, you see, your eyes tell you they are converging at a point. Absolutely false. How can you rely on your eyes that tell this falsehood, that parallel lines meet at a point? These classrooms, these lines, they meet at a point. They will meet in a horizon, they call it vanishing point. Now this is what our eyes tell you. And it was the discovery of this vanishing point, what we call vanishing point, that all parallel visions in our track, lines in our track will converge at a distant point. That experience introduced realism, what you call realism, into art and literature, especially with Renaissance. This is what Renaissance artists did. Renaissance experimented with this vanishing point and perspective. You have heard about the word perspective. And that was actually the inauguration of a movement in literature and art called realism. And that sense of realism told us that ever since Plato, that the business of art is an imitation of nature. Imitation of nature, mimetic theory, imitation of nature. And it reigned supreme till the end of 19th century, when this crisis I am speaking about happened, and they began to question the hegemony of the eyes. This is not true, we know, but we don't question. We take it for granted that parallel lines meet. Look at this photograph of a cathedral. You can't say it's real. Why? Because in this picture, the pillars of the same size grow smaller and smaller and smaller as it recedes. We know in reality that doesn't happen. But this is how we see. Or this is only way to represent reality for us. Okay. Da Vinci's Last Supper. Now technically the importance of Last Supper is Da Vinci was experimenting with classical perspective, monocular perspective, where the vanishing point is exactly in the center where Christ is placed. Christ's head is placed. The theory of perspective is vanishing point. All the parallel lines in our field of vision converge at the distant point, central point. So it becomes a transcendental figure, transcendental point, non-existent, transcendental, hypothetical point. But that is very essential for our understanding of the world, the reality. And it is at that point that Da Vinci places Christ there. And so all our experiences converge in the central figure of Christ. You can't miss Christ in the composition there, because he is centrally placed at the vanishing point. Like that, several artists began to experiment. They were thrilled with the feasibility of rendering three-dimensional reality into two-dimensional paper. It was a grand opening for them. And the hegemony of that perspective still reigns supreme, in photography. In photography, in cinema, what you call deep space is actually a rendering of perspective. Without perspective, you can't shoot. And it reigns supreme. That the hegemony lasts, it has been a long established control which modernism first challenged. I am going to introduce how modernism challenged this idea of the hegemony of eyes to represent reality. What kind of reality can you see or you represent? Okay. What is this? You call it a cube. A two-dimensional rendering, I am giving three dimensions by putting two sides here. One frontal side, then two sides. This is actually the perspectival rendering of a cube. But the whole thing is done on a plain paper or a plain screen, plain canvas. And what you get here in extra to drawing a two-dimensional diagram of a cube, you get additional information. You get a plenitude of information. You get a solidity of that object. That object becomes solid. That's why we call it three-dimensional. It becomes so dramatic. So dramatic. And that's why Browning used perspective in his dramatic monologue. What is Browning doing in dramatic monologue? Filippo Lippi, My Last Touches and all. He is using perspective, because here, if you look at this painting, besides giving a solid idea of the object, the artist is giving away an excess of information which he doesn't want to. What excess of information do you get from this picture? Other than the solid shape of the object. What excess information do you get? Because looking at this, you know exactly where the artist stood when he saw that. He must have stood below. He must have stood somewhere here. You can pinpoint that point here. And when you see that, what are you doing? You are replacing the artist. You are standing there as a viewer. You are looking at the object and you are seeing it as the artist saw. The artist is relegated to the background. The viewer becomes the artist. The viewer becomes sovereign. This is what cinema does. We speak about the sovereignty of the subject, cinematic subject. In the theatre, we are all sovereign subjects. We interpret what we see, we interpret the meaning. So this was a moment when the viewer was invited into the frame and supply a kind of meaning. Supply a kind of meaning. Let us go, you and I together, when the evening is spread out like a patient leatherized on a table. Who is you? Be the reader. We have to travel along with the poet, along with that proofread, to understand his crisis. We are invited. And this is what Baudelaire said, all actu. Eliot quoted that, all actu, mo semblable, mo frère. You reader, my fellow man, my brother. How we are his brothers? Because to interpret what he has done meaningfully, the viewer's subjectivity has to operate. The viewer has to understand the whole mechanism of representation. He has to understand the whole mechanism of representation, which I will explain later. What is this? Normally, you ask any child, what is this? The sun. Okay, the sun. All over the world, we will say this is the sun. Has anyone seen a sun like that? Of course, sun's rays are represented. It's actually a kind of shorthand notation for the experience of the sun. But what will happen? What will happen when a painter actually takes his canvas, goes into nature in the early morning and paints the rising sun? As he sees it, the world says we don't understand. This was painted by Monet, the first impressionist painting that earned its name, Impression Sunrise. That was the name, Impression Sunrise. He doesn't call it sunrise, he calls it Impression Sunrise. He took his canvas, went out and painted there, exhibited it, and people said it's not a painting at all. We don't understand that. That happens to cinema. You show somebody brushing his teeth for 3 seconds, they will say we don't understand. But when you show somebody, students jumping onto the platform and the teacher is talking and dancing and then dance around and go to a tree and dance, a hit, popular hit. Now this is how we understand reality, and this created a crisis. This created a crisis in representation. What exactly was that crisis? I'll explain. The crisis of the eyes, the hegemony of the eyes. What you see is not real. About Monet, some critics said, Monet is only an eye. He paints what he sees. Monet is only an eye, but my God, what an eye. What an eye. That was a moment when actually visual art broke away with the kind of realism that was inaugurated with the invention of perspective. Because, Impressionists believed that you have to depend only on your eye. Depict the world as you see, they underline, as you see. And when they started looking at the nature, they saw so many things that we don't see. They see so many colors. They see the sky is not blue. They see the wall is not white. They see so many secondary colors. They see that there is no color called the black in nature. They were first to argue that there is no color called black in nature. And when they started painting that, people began to say, we don't understand. Because that was a moment when our visual perception became a kind of crucial point of debate between art and common sense, common within brackets. So this is the crisis I am going to introduce. Another painting by Claude Monet, boat jetty. But here, actually, if you look at the treatment, it's an entirely revolutionary treatment. Rather than it's actually a breakaway from the realist rendition. You find there are no black colors, all shadows of colors. And then the theme of this painting, whatever he calls it, the theme is sunlight. Because Impressionism was obsessed with sunlight. Because with sunlight we see the world. And what is so special about sunlight? Sunlight is so fickle. Every moment sunlight changes. So the reality they saw in sunlight was also fickle. That is the first time they began to realize that there is nothing called, monolithic reality. Reality is very subjective. That's why Impressionism is called subjective rendering of an objective reality. Reality may be there out, but you can't define that. You can only know it subjectively. And that was a moment, I speak about a crucial moment, when the crisis began to be defined, when modern art began to be extremely subjective. The subjective element creeps into modern art and literature, and there was a shift, paradigm shift from mimetic theory to expressive theory. Expressive theory. That is, the business of an artist is not to represent the world outside in imitation, but articulate his own inner reality. So that articulation of expression became a key function of modern art, and that introduced modernism. That is the meaning in which Baudelaire wrote that essay, A Painter of Modern Times. Representation of the present, and he called it not presentation of the present, representation of the present. Representation means only impression, and representation also means so many things. How do you represent? You have this paper, and you represent this paper how? With a duplicate. So the word representation introduces actually a duality between this paper that is an object and what is represented as an image. What is represented is an image. So representation of the world means imaging the world. The whole imaging of the world through images. Okay, what is wrong with that? What is wrong with that is we come to a certain point at which the image becomes a real for us. The image becomes a real for us. We spread out a map on the table and say, this is India, this is Pakistan, this is Bangladesh. We say that. You reduce the whole vast expanse of reality into, like the sun, notational sun, we reduce them into a diagrammatic representation. And we literally believe that that is real. And modernism began to question this reduction of the immensity of reality to just a mere, shadowy representation. Okay. This is Vincent van Gogh, a favorite painter of all of yours, Impressionist painter. Vincent van Gogh, the last painting he said, "Wheat field with cross." And Vincent van Gogh becomes crucial because he was an Impressionist painter, but in his paintings he introduced another element which led to the subsequent movement called Expressionism. From Vincent van Gogh, I am jumping to this painting. We were discussing this painting earlier on one occasion. Prakash was speaking about that. The Scream by Edward Munch. And the Scream introduces a movement called Expressionism. And Vincent van Gogh, was an Impressionist painter, but his paintings became intensely subjective because he was passing through so many traumatic experiences. And he committed suicide. He shot himself in his chest. So he was a miserable painter who suffered all his life, not able to sell a single painting in his life. There is a whole lot we can speak about Vincent van Gogh, but important point is that Vincent van Gogh introduced that level of the psyche, human psyche, which verges on the theme of insanity, irrationality, dreams, and paranoia, all these things into visual art. For the first time, visual art becomes actually very, very uncanny and very frightening. And Munch's painting The Scream shows exactly that, autobiographical. One night, moonlit night, he was walking through a bridge with two of his friends. He imagined that he could hear a scream growing from within. And the scream, first inaudible, became insufferably loud. And he shut his ears. He ran straight to his studio. And that night, he sat and made a black and white wood cut of that. Later he colored. So many versions he painted. But the scream introduces the kind of the cosmic angst that became identified with modernism. Especially that psychological insecurity, sense of insecurity, which became central themes in modernism. Another epigrammatic statement of violence and trauma in expressionist painting by a German expressionist painter, Max Beckmann, Night. It's not a moonlit night. It's a night showing the interior. And what is happening? A drama, a terrible, frightening drama of a few people, attackers, barging into a house, crashing, and subjecting the husband and wife to extreme torture. And this became a hallmark of expressionist movement. All disturbing themes of violence, insanity, sense of insecurity, incompatibilities in human relationship. All these things. As Virginia Woolf said, something happened in human relationships. This was what was happening in human relationship. Incompatibility in man-woman relationship. And everything you can trace back to its sociological origin, its historical origin, the war. That war that loomed in the background. Everything changed. The whole grammar of life and culture changed with war, especially in human relationships. I'll show you some examples. Kafka, Metamorphosis. The frightening, uncanny experience of magical realism. What is so magical about magical realism? Associated with people like, Kafka and so many people. Because, they use the syntax of realism to depict something very uncanny. From the realistic, you fly off at a tangent to the marvelous. And that's so frightening. Baudelaire inaugurated that. A ghost in the dead of the night, we can take it for granted. That's the usual grammar. Ghosts must appear at the dead of the night, wearing white clothes and all these things. We know. But if a ghost stops you in broad daylight, in Trichure market, that will be more frightening. In daylight, ghosts are not supposed to, enter the world in broad daylight. And this is what Baudelaire wrote in La Fleur du Mal, The Flowers of Evil, where spectres stop the passers-by. That's what he says. Where the spectres stop the passers-by. And Eliot uses that in The Wasteland. So that is magical realism. Frighteningly magical realism. And Kafka, minute by minute, second by second, somebody is being transformed into a beetle. Very frightening. And it's that kind of juxtaposition of the real and the marvelous that creates the kind of uncanny feeling of modernism. Eliot's Wasteland, so many examples of that we have even in The Wasteland, where the real and the frightening coincide. The protagonist is walking through London Bridge, where he sees somebody he met in the first Punic War. You Stetson, you were with me in the ships at Miley. From the 20th century realism, is immediately plunging into ancient, Roman history, Peloponnesian War. So that kind of feeling is so phantasmagoric. That was special about modernism and Kafka, for example. This is another expressionistic, neo-expressionistic painting by Gregory Gillespie, Monument for a Vietnam Shrine. And you know how expressionism becomes an articulation of violence, all these things. This is an anti-war painting against war. Visibly and viscerally very disturbing. And from that, when we come to a painting like this, The Persistence of Memory by Salvador Dali. The scene changes. The grammar, the syntax changes. The whole meaning changes. What you find here? Melting clocks. Melting clocks, and ants are there, a sleeping figure is there, a leafless tree is there. Why the clock is melting? What's the logic of the clock melting? Persistence of memory. How do you read it? What was his logic? This is a surrealist painting. Dali was a surrealist painter, and from expressionism, when you come to surrealism, it was actually a kind of going back into the depths of the artist himself. When the world becomes meaningless, you can salvage some meaning by mining some meaning in your unconscious, by mining some of the shards of the past from your subconscious. So they lost faith in humanity, they lost faith in reality. What was only real was what was happening in your unconscious, not even conscious, in your unconscious. And how to articulate that unconscious reality, that dreamlike experience, that introduced a movement called surrealism. They called it superior realism. The world of the dreams, the world of the unconscious is a kind of superior realism, in which the meaning will be through analogies. And surrealism was defined by a theoretician Apollinaire like that. It's a beautiful encounter between a sewing machine and an umbrella on a dissecting table. If you can imagine a sewing machine and an umbrella accidentally meeting in the operation theatre of a hospital, that is brilliant surrealism. Is there any logic according to common sense? An umbrella and sewing machine, and that too they meet in an area where it's alien to both. Operation theatre. What's the common factor? Apparently very absurd meeting, but when you look into that analogically, the logic is some kind of stitching is involved in the making of an umbrella. So that establishes a connection between sewing machine and umbrella. You need some kind of sewing to make an umbrella. Then, what does a surgeon do in the operation theatre? Stitching, suture. So the whole notion of suture, the analogy of suture, connects an umbrella, a sewing machine, and an operation theatre brilliantly logical. You can't controvert that. That's why they call superior logic, superior reality. Super reality or surrealism. One important famous painting. This was actually the crisis I spoke about, crisis of representation. Rene Magritte, the false mirror. Which is a false mirror? Human eye is a false mirror. I told you about it. You look at parallel lines and you see them converging. Your eyes tell you some kind of lie. The whole world is a fake. If I show you this and ask you the color of this, you may say red or something like that. Take it as red. You say this is red. An apple is red, you will say. A mango, maybe green mango is green. What actually happens there? The apple, when the sunlight falls on the apple absorbs all the colors to itself and rejects the red. Apple says, I don't need red. And red is kept outside as an alien, outsider. The red forms the periphery. It gathers on the periphery of that contour of that apple. And when you look at it, you see only red. And you say apple is red. Apple says, I don't want red. You say apple is red. This is how you see the world in colors, called reflected light technology. Reflected light technology, you see light as reflected on an object. And how do light reflect? Object absorbs other lights. Object says, I don't want certain lights, and reflects it back. You receive it as your reality. Okay. And Magritte has put a black spot, black speck exactly in the center of the human eye. You don't see. You see what is only opaque. There's a whole discourse about that, in My Name is Red by Johann Pamuk. The atelier painters of miniature in Persia in the 15th century, when perspective was being invented in Europe. He speaks about that background. These Islamic painters, when they reach a mastery, Orhan Pamuk says they will take a needle and pierce their own eyes. Pierce their own eyes. Why? To block the false world from entering them. They want to depict reality as they can see within, to block sight. So this binary between sight on the one hand and insight on the other became very acute with surrealism. They banned sight and prioritized insight. And Freud was a great influence, and dream world was an influence, and they wanted to explore the unconscious, the world of the unconscious. This is by Magritte, and he has written there in the painting, this is not a pipe. This is not a pipe. Why he says this is not a pipe? We know this is a pipe. He says this is not a pipe. We know this is a piece of paper. And I say this is not, I show a picture and a picture of this, and I say that's not a piece of paper. This is not me. This is not me. Why? How can I say that? Because what he means is simply, this is not pipe as an object, this is an image of a pipe. This is a representation of a pipe. A pipe is being represented graphically as a painting. But why should we know that? Why? Because we tend to forget that. We tend to forget that he wants to reiterate the fact, don't mistake images for reality. Get the point. The whole problem with the world is we mistake images for reality. We know how it happens in politics and other things. This again a surrealist painting by Max Ernst, Oedipus Rex. He relates again to myth, the myth of Oedipus. Another seminal myth in modernism is Oedipus myth. Why that happens in surrealism? What is the story of Oedipus? Oedipus, once he realizes that he has committed incest and he killed his own father and married his own mother Jocasta, once he comes to know of that, what he does? He blinds himself. He slashes his eyeballs. He becomes blind. And he says, drive me into the wilderness as a beggar. So this theme of slicing the eyeball is there. And what does it mean for surrealism? Slicing the eyeball, you cut the sight and you turn within you for the insight. Sight has to be blocked. Sight has to be sliced to pry into the kind of insight, world of insight inside. Now I will show you a clipping from a surrealist movie, famous celebrated surrealist movie, Antony. I can't find it here. Antony. The opening shot of Antony. A surrealist movie shot by Dali and another surrealist filmmaker, Buñuel. Once upon a time, it starts on a fairy tale note. Yeah, Shanmugam, I got it from Shanmugam, this clipping. The whole movie I got it from him. Antony. What happens? In the next shot, nothing happens to the girl, she comes, nothing has happened to her eye. Now, this is the world of fantasy, magical realism. But the gesture is very significant. As a surrealist, you have to slice your eyeball and look within. Get the point? Now, from there you come to a painting like this. Painting like this by Marcel Duchamp, LHOOQ. LHOOQ is a short form of a very obscene word. I don't know whether I can, whether it is parliamentary to, you can refer Google, the full form of LHOQ. But not that obscene to modern generations like you. Marcel Duchamp takes Mona Lisa, famous painting, celebrated, iconic painting by Da Vinci, and draws a moustache and a goatee beard. He says he is annotating Mona Lisa. And what's the meaning behind that? Mona Lisa has become the cultural icon of the Western world, even today. More than 6 billion people visit her annually. And she is kept in 3 bulletproof cages. And she is assigned 6 bodyguards for her. And even 6 million people visit her annually. Such a glorious, such a celebrity, Mona Lisa. And Duchamp takes that Mona Lisa and then draws moustache and goatee beard. On the one hand, the meaning of the gesture is something has happened to that world of Western culture. Something is rotten in Western culture. So that annotation is actually a kind of desecration in one sense, but we know there are deeper levels, because Duchamp was a very controversial painter. He was a Dadaist actually. This is Dadaism. And Dadaism was a movement against all art. They were an anti-art movement. Because they said an artist doesn't create anything at all. Artist doesn't create anything at all. What does the artist do? Artist only discovers things. Only discovers things. And then, Dadaism actually problematized gender binaries. And Duchamp was a cross-dresser. He used to dress like a woman and used to play game of chess with women. There are so many photographs of Duchamp playing game of chess with women, dressed as a woman. So that liminal, gender expressions were inscribed into Duchamp's life, and gender was very fluid for Surrealists and for Dadaists and for Duchamp especially. Yeah.
Nude descending.
Except nude descending a staircase. A kinetic, giving kinesis to, yeah, you're right. And my point is that Duchamp was actually trying to articulate his own inner confusions about gender. And he is masculinizing Mona Lisa actually, a kind of masculine element. And when Mona Lisa was shown by BBC for a documentary, Mona Lisa was shown to so many people reacted. There is a masculine element and she looks like a man. And Duchamp is actually taking it out, teasing out that masculine element in Mona Lisa, one thing. Then there is a kind of gender fluidity. She is both man and woman. The kind of same gender fluidity you can find in Wasteland also. Who is the third who walks always beside you? When I count, there are only you and I together. But there is always another one following you. I don't know whether a man or a woman. Gender is neutral. And in Scream by Edward Munch, gender is neutral. In that figure, it can be both a man and a woman. So this problematizing of gender was another modernist tendency which became acute with movements like Surrealism and Dadaism. I am only giving you a hint, and Duchamp may be pointing to that. This is a sculpture discovered by Duchamp. When a gallery invited for an artifact for his work, he went to a sanitary shop, bought a porcelain closet, and wrote a false name, signature, El Mata, and sent it for the exhibition. The gallery promptly returned it, refused to accept it. But today, art critics believe that this was one of the most seminal expressions of modernism in the world, European modernism. It was not even his own. What was he trying to tell us? By selecting a closet and sending it to a gallery for a major show, what was he trying to tell us? He called it fountain. And fountains in Western architecture, a fountain is a seminal center of Western culture in all major cities. Fountains by Bernini, fountains by Fellini, almost all great artists have created fountains. In Italy, Milan, Florence, we have celebrated fountains, Fountain of Four Rivers and all. And here, Duchamp has a fountain. What is that fountain? A closet. The statement is, something is obviously rotten in Western culture. Western culture stinks. That was a statement he wanted to do it very, very viscerally, concrete, in a concrete effect. This is a Dadaist poem by a famous Dadaist poet, Hugo Ball, a Dadaist poem. Caravane. If you try to read it, doesn't make any sense at all. Doesn't make. He was a celebrated poet who wrote poetry like this. What does it mean? It doesn't mean anything at all. So Dadaism, I told you, were the proponents of nonsense. Against sense, they posited nonsense. Against sanity, they posited insanity. Against reason, rationality, they posited madness and a kind of insanity. It was an anarchic movement. They wanted to give a shock treatment to the people. And it was actually a kind of caricature art. It was a very critical intrusion into the German culture and all Western culture. They wanted to subject Western culture to severe shock treatment, and their attack on language, human language. What does human language mean? When this was happening, this actually happened in 30s. Even in the 20s, our knowledge of language changed. Saussure came and said language has no meaning at all. The word dog has no meaning. Whatever meaning the language has is only a differential meaning. Language assumes meaning only through differences. What will happen, a dog, we agree to call that dog a cat from tomorrow onwards. CAT cat. Will anything happen to the dog? We understand by CAT cat we mean that dog. Will anything happen to the dog? No. But society, English speaking society, competent society has decided this is a word for that. And CAT cat is a word for this creature. Quite arbitrarily. What does it mean? It means nothing at all. And Bashir laughs at this idea in his term Hundrapi Kusandi. Hundrapi Kusandi. What does it mean? No. It can mean something for me, it can mean something for you. So that kind of attitude to language, what kind of sanity does language, what kind of sense does language introduce? Absolute nonsense. This is why our so-called sense is nonsense, and beyond that nonsense, they are positing another kind of sense through insanity, irrationality and all. I will show you Caravane performed by Hugo Ball, actual performance. That is the performance. I'll just show you. Now what happens is, they will meet at a point in a cafe, gallery, Dada, and it will be a performance. He will come and start reciting these poems, and people will start throwing stones at him. The more stones they throw, the happier the artist is, because it seems that they are somehow affected. And finally, even the pianist can't endure that, and the performance comes to an end. I will show you Hugo Ball performing. He is actually reciting Caravane. It's all absurd performance. Hugo Ball enters with a Ku Klux Klan cap and all these things. This is Hugo Ball. He is reciting Caravane. People are throwing stones. Even the pianist can't endure that. The performance comes to an end. All rowdy performance by Dadaism, an example of that. Now, if you find it meaningless, I will show you another performance of your favorite actor Charlie Chaplin in modern times. He's working in a hotel as a singer, but he doesn't know how to sing. Sing, never mind the words. A typical Dadaist performance. Sorry, I will stop here. Now, what is actually Chaplin doing? And the lady says, sing, never mind the words. No lyrics are required for music. Now, if you find it meaningless, absurd, can you visualize a mother who has given birth to a babe, say 1 week old, talking to the child? The mother talking to a child who is only maybe 3 days old. The mother has no problem, the child has no problem. What kind of language can that mother talk? Sheer Dadaism, no? Sheer Dadaism, it's profusely meaningful for them in that way. But Chaplin was actually hitting at this central point of Dadaism, that is satirizing the whole modern society, the meaning of poetry, the meaning of language, so-called refined culture and all. And in Great Dictator, he mimics Hitler. We don't have time. He mimics Hitler in a brilliant manner, satirizes Hitler. He was in the hit list of Gestapo actually. So Dadaism was a kind of political movement in that it was a very powerful satirical tool to pry into the evils of society. And we have our classical example of the apotheosis of Dadaism, if you remember, Waiting for Godot. Beckett's Waiting for Godot. I'll just show you Waiting for Godot being performed just a little bit to get a feel of that. I'll just
They blast hell to heaven!
the speech of famous speech of Lucky,
Reasons unknown, that is a result of the public works of Puncher and Watman. It is established beyond all doubt that in view of the labours of Falkhoff and Belcher, left unfinished for reasons unknown of Testu and Kennard, left unfinished, it is established what many deny, that man in posse of Testu and Kennard, that man in Effie, that man in Short, that
sheer
man in
nonsense,
Reed,
sheer
the
nonsense.
strikes of
So many pages.
defecation, wastes and pines, wastes and pines, and then the earth, namely the air, and then the earth, and the great cold, the great dark.
Is what Beckett was doing actually. It was an attack on, consistent attack on the so-called sanity of modern language. And how to, you have to create your own language. As Eliot says, purifying the dialect of the tribe, each generation has to find their own means of articulation. The language has to be refined, language has to change, imagery has to change. And modernism actually met with that crisis. They had to find a vocabulary, a kind of idiom, and kind of grammar for articulating that kind of cultural experience that was quite uncanny. After the Auschwitz, what language? The war in the background. After the Auschwitz, what kind of romanticism? That was a feeling they had. And from which some kind of sanity was trying to be teased out by paintings like this. I'll stop with this movement called Cubism. This is a famous, that painting inaugurated Cubism by Picasso, La Demoiselle d'Avignon, the women of Avignon. While all this was happening in France, in Germany, and in all these places, Picasso quite silently was introducing a seminal attack on traditional art and the grammar of traditional art by rejecting perspective and all conventional Western art norms. And that resulted in a movement called Cubism. And this particular painting, he was actually painting a few prostitutes, women of Avignon. And he was actually, there is a criticism that Cubism dehumanized these people. But anyway, his argument was, any object in nature can be reduced to its basic geometric shapes. How do you draw a face? There are no lines in nature. There are no shapes in nature. But you see lines, you see shapes. It's a human faculty. And we understand the whole world in imaging. We transform an object into an image by arbitrarily tracing the contours of that in a linear manner. It's highly arbitrary, and you resort to geometry. Any shape in nature can be reduced to basic geometric shapes. Cube, cylinder, cone, all these things. That's why that movement is called Cubism. That's why, sorry. Just a few more only. I will close up exactly at 12:30. See, this is how Picasso draws a cubist figure. He starts drawing bulls like that. Even before that, there was a stage. This is the seventh stage of a bull, realistic bull. And finally, when it comes to this figure, it's the essence of the bull. It's the essence of the bull, and this is the bull that we see as a cubist bull. And it's a long journey of reduction of the unnecessary. And he says, in one interview says, as an artist you have to see into the essence of things. And actually the word abstract means essence. You write an abstract of a thesis. The word abstract means an essence. And all abstract art is actually a kind of quintessential definition of the world in essential form. And that was the approach of Cubism, to grasp the essence of an object. And people say we don't understand, this is not a human face and all these things, for which Picasso had his own explanation. And about this painting, people will say even a child can draw. Even a child can draw that. What is so great in that? Only a child can draw. We can't see a bull like that. Can we see a bull like that? Because why? Our vision is contaminated by seeing. Our eyesight is contaminated by realism. You can't see a bull like this. It requires immense training. And as an answer, Picasso said, at the age of 8, I could paint like Raphael, Renaissance painter Raphael. At the age of 8, I was a child prodigy. I could paint like Raphael. It took me 80 years to learn to draw like a child. Learn to draw like a child. That's his answer. That was Cubism. Again, what is Cubism doing? He takes a model, a close friend of it, and he walks around that model and draws that model, shape of that model on the same canvas from different angles. And it doesn't look like a human face. No, he doesn't want it. He says it's the essence of that face. In classical portraits, you see only one side. Portrait or profile, you see only one side of the face. And Picasso asked, what is more real? A conventional face for Mona Lisa shows us only one side of the face. But I will give you two sides of the face. What is more real? A painting that gives you only one side, or a painting that gives you two sides? The quantum of reality is great in Cubism. Because Cubism walks around. That is what Cubism does. Cubism approximates an object to a sculpture. This is how you see a sculpture. You walk around an object and you see that object from different angles and configure all these angles into a same composite image. That is the essence of Cubism as exemplified in this painting. Of course, his famous masterpiece, Guernica, is an anti-war, celebrated anti-war painting done in black and white. And Picasso was in Paris when Guernica, the Spanish town, was decimated in bombing, fascist bombing. And this was his protest movement. He refused to exhibit it in Spain for a long time. And all that he stood for, his passion for human freedom, his passion for democracy, and all these things come here. And all his images are there, pet images. Grenade, horse, bull, screaming women, running away. And the entire violence of war is shown in his massive mural called Guernica. And how do you transfer Cubism into literature? If you think of literature, Cubist literature, it is an example of Cubist literature written by Gertrude Stein, who was a close friend of Picasso. He has shown Picasso. Something had been coming out of him. Certainly it had been coming out of him. Certainly it was something. Certainly it had been coming out of him. And it had meaning, a charming meaning, a solid meaning, a struggling meaning, a clear meaning. One whom some were certainly following, and some were certainly following him. One whom was certainly following was one certainly working. What is Cubist around it? She takes the image of Picasso and walks around the central concept of Picasso in so many languages, in so many statements. And each statement reinforces the idea of that figure who is described. A kind of trace, reinforcement through traces. Like deposits, each statement like a deposit comes and concretizes the whole image. And Gertrude Stein, who was associated with Hemingway, Dos Passos, Fitzgerald, she was also a close friend of Picasso. She wanted to practice Cubist writing. Her famous Cubist statement is this: a rose is a rose is a rose is a rose. What does it mean? Every rose is different. You know why? Every rose is different. Because when you come to a second rose, you come to a second rose with a memory of the first rose. Cumulative. Similarly, you come to third rose. The two roses already hover in our memory, etched in our memory. So in memory, a kind of archaic creature, as Derrida would say, writing in the memory. And we read in memory. Memory actually concretizes the rose. Every rose you approach is different. That's why every poem is different. I read daffodils at the age of 9 or 10 maybe. I read daffodils now. Daffodils is daffodils is daffodils is daffodils. You can say like that. It changes. Changes. Get the point. And I will stop with a brilliant performance, Cubist performance, a very brilliant Cubist performance. I'll stop my. You look at this Cubist speech. ഇത് എന്തോ കേൾക്കാമോ?
കഴിക്കുള്ളൂ.
വിശക്കുകയാണെങ്കിൽ ഭക്ഷണം മാത്രമേ നമ്മൾ കഴിക്കുള്ളൂ.
കേരളത്തിൽ ഭക്ഷണം കിട്ടിയില്ലെങ്കിൽ ഭക്ഷണം നമ്മൾ വാങ്ങും.
സ്വിഗ്ഗി ഉണ്ട്, സൊമാറ്റോ.
ഇല്ലെങ്കിൽ നമ്മൾ ഭക്ഷണം ഉണ്ടാക്കണം. ദോശ ഒന്നും കിട്ടിയില്ലെങ്കിലും നമ്മൾ അത് ഉണ്ടാക്കണം. കേരളത്തിൽ തൃപ്പൂണിത്തുറ, അതിരമ്പുഴ, തൃശ്ശൂർ, കോട്ടയം, കേരളത്തിൽ രാജ്യങ്ങൾ മാത്രമേ
ഉള്ളൂ.
കേരളം നമ്മുടെ രാജ്യമാണെന്ന്
ഭയങ്കര പൊളിറ്റിക്കൽ സ്റ്റേറ്റ്മെൻ്റ് ആണ്.
എല്ലാവർക്കും അറിയാം.
Yeah, I conclude my speech on this note. Brilliant, kid's performance by this kid, and I dedicate my talk to the children of the world. Being Children's Day today, I will wind up my session with this.